So as you get into the game and start to play, building your golf bag out as you improve and play more is massively exciting, but incredibly complex. And the amount of options out there are just confusing as heck. This is why you're going to get a couple of experienced fitters' perspectives on what the best thing to build a bag out with is. Once you've gone beyond that to potentially box set that you just get into the game with, what are the key things to put in the bag, and most importantly, why, and how is that going to help you move forward? Broadly overviewing, looking at it, why is it important at this stage of your kind of golfing journey to really think about the set? And we see it in the bay day in, day out.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously you allowed 14 clubs, 13 full clubs and a putter, but that doesn't necessarily mean that when you start the journey you need all those golf clubs from a gapping perspective potentially. So it's essential that you get the clubs that are relevant to your game at that point in time, and then you can also add to those at a later date, whether that be adding things at the top end of the bag or the bottom end of the bag. But you don't necessarily need to start with 14, but you might end up with there eventually.
Yeah, I mean, we regularly see golfers who've gone with best intentions, seen a brand they like or a player that plays a certain club, or they look nice, so they decided to go for them and got a complete set, and then have 2 or 3 clubs that do the same job. So the last thing you want is to be carrying around extra clubs that you're just never going to use. It creates confusion, so that you know that if you take this club out the bag, why you're using it and what it's going to give you. So we'll go from top down. I think we'll start at the top end of the bag. Driver or driving club. There are some options now: drivers, mini drivers, strong lofted fairway woods, but getting off the tee, so important now in the game.
Vitally important. And again, like I mentioned at the start, it might not be that you necessarily need a driver. To start with, it could be a free wood. I think you absolutely nailed it with the comment there about having 14 clubs, but them causing a bit of confusion at the top end of the bag. So actually it might be that you have a free wood, but rather than hitting that off the deck, it might be actually something that you use it as a driving club to start with. Shorter in length, more manageable length, generally is what we see in the bay, more manageable loft per se as well. So absolutely, sometimes it's technique dependent, as we find in the bays. Some people, their technique lends itself to driver. For some people, actually, shorter shaft, bit more loft on the head, like a free wood, that lends itself to getting them off the tee just to start with. So it really depends, how confident you feel with the longer length driver in hand to start with, I think, as well. Yeah,
golf's a hard game. It's a hard game for beginners, it's a hard game for the tour pros. They make it look easy, but it's still a very tough game to play. And if you can get off the tee consistently, and consistency is the key, it doesn't have to be the longest potential distance, but if you can regularly put yourself in play, you're able to play the course from a positive start point rather than constantly hitting in the rough or the trees or the heather and having to chop out sideways. That's not very fun. But sacrificing, I'll use that sort of verted commas, but sacrificing 15, 20 yards, 30 yards over what your maximum could be with a driver, but putting it in play 5, 6 times out of 10 rather than once or twice out of 10, and requiring a career swing to do it, that's where potentially the fairway wood versus the driver as a teeing off option could be a benefit. The one thing, we're clearly in the business of fitting clubs, and if you have the ability to go somewhere where you can get fitted, that will give you the best advice. However, it's critical to try. Whatever you're thinking about buying, try it out and make sure it works for you, because that's the only way you know whether there's any relevance in that club for you or not.
Yeah, it could be the latest and greatest product, and there's some great product out there, but if it isn't the right spec for you in terms of loft, length, etc., shaft weight, then it's going to cause more harm than it's going to help you with. And I think in that instance, that, like you said there, I would definitely go out, try it, hit it, see if you get on with the product to start with, and if not, don't be afraid to say, actually, driver for me right now isn't the right play. I need to put something else in that's going to allow me to, as you say, consistently get off the tee and get into play. Mini drivers, interestingly enough, started to come into the market last couple of years. We've seen a big take up on those. Shorter length, bit more loft, more manageable head. I think for the beginner golfer, who knows, they might be what we see in the bag more often than the full length driver, which I think is a bit of a specialist club nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, they tend to be limited run products currently. Hopefully they'll come into mainstream. But But you look at some of the best players out there, Henrik Stenson, go back when he was winning his majors, an unbelievably good 3-wood player, and he's still very good with the driver. Proportionally, his 3-wood was his real strength, and that was what gave him the platform to score as well as he did the most of the time. I mean, it helps if you hit your 3-wood a very long way, but it's the same principle. He used that hole after hole after hole, and the driver was an occasional club if he needed the extra yardage. But he knew he'd hit his 3-wood and play more regularly. So don't always reach straight for the driver. But if you can use it, and say if you've tried it and tested it and you can use it and it's consistent, great, go for it. If not, think about the fairway wood.
Don't be afraid to drop it out and just start with the fairway wood, absolutely.
So we've talked about fairway wood as an option off the tee. Now, the primary function, fairway wood, distance, club off the ground, off the fairway. And again, this is another area where a fairway wood may or may not be the best option, but loft comes into play a lot with this as well.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, obviously you go all the way from a 3-wood, which is traditionally sort of a 15 degree, all the way up to we have 9 woods now, 11 woods actually in the past as well, heaven woods, you might have heard that term before, that run all the way up to sort of 24, 25 degrees effectively. Loft is going to be your friend when you're first building a bag, that's for sure, no two ways about that. So I think you want to try and get as much loft in hand as you possibly can, would be my advice there, because it's going to help you get the ball, especially off the deck, and then it's going to give you that forgiveness as well and that height that you're looking for.
Yeah, again, consistency. I think you'll hear us come back to this word consistency because that's the bit that you can build your game out from. Yeah. Loft height, flight height, particularly when you're trying to get a ball airborne off the ground, loft helps you get it in the air, therefore you get carry distance. Carry distance is key to getting consistency of yardage and being able to, if you know you can hit 130, 140 yards, 160 yards through the air, par threes. That's another area where a lofted wood and a hybrid, which we'll come on to shortly, they can really help you fly the ball onto the green and get some control when it lands. Whereas if you're trying to play a low lofted fairway wood or low lofted clubs, low flighted clubs, they don't stop. And they're very hard to get up in the air. So get a club that helps you get it airborne. The shaft length, fairway wood versus hybrid, which I'll take out the bag now, that can be a really significant difference in this part of the bag in particular as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a rule, shorter the shaft, the easier it's going to be to hit, because the moment arm is going to be a little bit smaller, so it's going to be easier to get club back onto ball, no two ways about that. Again, a little bit of technique comes into this, so I would hit them before you make a decision on whether you're going to go for high lofted fairway wood or lower lofted hybrid and what suits the technique wise. But in today's kind of box sets, they do a little bit of both. And I know we traditionally fit with a little bit of both as well in the bags that we traditionally do, don't we? We try and have a bit of both in there, I would say.
Yeah, and to show that the length differential, if I pop the butt end of the club on the floor there, you can see there's a good few inches worth of difference in length, and you put that into context of standing to the ball. If I address the club with the hybrid, this is where I have to stand, whereas with a fairway wood, it's out there. So actually, you've got that much less club to have to control into the back of the ball. So striking, the longer the club gets, the harder it is to deliver that with consistency to the back of the ball. And that's why as you move up the bag, yes, loft plays a part. The lower the loft the club, the harder it is to get a consistent result from. You get more side spin. So loft gives you a bit more backspin, which helps retain a bit of stability and straightness. But a shorter shaft length is easier to control and easier to strike. So in this bit of the bag, this may be where off the ground as a distance fairway club, the longest shot may be with a fairway wood, but the most reliable one might be with a hybrid.
Absolutely.
So that's seriously something to consider as well.
Absolutely.
Onto the irons. So many different styles of head, shapes. Yeah, it's confusing as to why you might use one versus the other. So we've picked a couple of heads here. One traditionally kind of more blade style, which is the one I've got here, and a more kind of perimeter weighted cavity back, inverted commas game improvement style that Nick's holding. So what are the differences between them?
Well, as a rule, and as you said, this is what they call a perimeter weighted golf club. So the weight is around, as you can see, the perimeter here, and particularly into the toe area, which makes that head more stable. And so via that, again, it's effectively extending the sweet spot across the face. So it's just giving you a bit more room for error, effectively, is what that's going to give you. Traditionally, these irons as well, they're a little bit bigger in size. The sole shape is also a little bit bigger, which is going to give you that little bit of forgiveness as the club enters into the turf. It's going to resist the digging of that front edge a little bit more as well. And also by having that slightly bigger sole, they can drop the weight back a little bit, which is also going to give you more launch and the capability to provide, again, more height, like we spoke about with the fairway woods. That's something that seems to be coming up a lot in our conversation, but it really is something that as you start the game and as you're getting into the game, you're going to benefit from that additional flight. It's going to give you control over your irons, your fairway woods, your hybrids. So that's important.
And the things to look for with the heads, there are a lot of heads now that have these sort of characteristics but might look like this. So the key things to look at are, if you've got a fairly small sort of size of head and a narrow sole, there's not very far that you can move the weight to give you that forgiveness. It's like doing that with a stance. The further I move my foot back, the more resistance to twisting and resistance to forces I've got. If it's a narrow sole, it's not going to have a lot of forgiveness. If it's a wide sole, it can look like this, but what it'll be hollow inside. So all the weight's being moved to the perimeter, giving you lots of stability off centre, resistance to twisting, margin of error. And this really hurts, and when you miss-hit it in the winter, when it's cold, your fingers will sting. This will give you far more margin of error. So that's certainly something as a style of head to look for when you're selecting heads, is something that, you know, it may not look as traditionally as pretty as some of the other heads, but you'll thank yourself for giving yourself some margin of error to start with. The other bit's the amount of irons. They go from all the way from sort of most of them 4 or 5 iron, 4 iron now, down to pitch wedge, gap wedge, sand wedge, lob wedge, but certainly down to a sand wedge in those. So what would we be looking for, or what should we advise about kind of where to stop? Where do you stop the set in terms of what iron to go up to at the top end, the long iron end?
Yeah, sure. I think the capabilities obviously come into this in terms of the amount of speed that you bring to the table as well. What I would say is, if you're building a bag and you've got quite good club head speed and you're able to produce a lot of ball speed, then long irons might be playable for you. But if you're somebody who suffers from, they're not quite as quick and you can't produce the speed, then at that point in time, taking loft off the golf club isn't going to be your friend. So that's where hybrids might come into it. So you might decide to drop the amount of irons you're playing at the top end of the bag, maybe the 4 iron, the 5 iron, and integrate in hybrids or fairway woods like we spoke about at that point in time. But that's where you're going to need some advice on that. I'd go and see a club fitter who can advise you through that sort of conversation. I think that would be quite difficult to just do on your own, unless you've got the technology to be able to see exactly what flights are being produced, launch monitors, etc. So I would really seek the advice of somebody who can guide you through where you need to stop that particular iron, and a lot of the time nowadays, 5 iron for a lot of golfers is probably about as high
or
as
even at the early end 6 iron. What we'll do is we'll give you a bit of a depiction now of a long iron hit at different speed, and then the hybrid. So we're going to do one hit, and this is a 4 iron. Going to do one hit at a fairly strong speed, and then I'm going to drop the speed down, and we'll see where the spin and the launch and the carry distances go to. And then I'm going to swing the hybrid at the same speed as the moderate speed. So I'm going to start with a fairly strong hit with a long iron. And this is really to show where the ball speed differentials make a big difference. So if I hit this kind of fairly kind of normal pace for me, I really hit it, but we're at strong club speed. We've got 14 launch, 4,300 spin, so there's enough flight to keep that ball in the air, 190 yards. Now, if all I do is I drop my club speed by, let's see how accurate I'll be, roughly 10 miles an hour. So we've taken 12 or 13 miles an hour off, but the spin's dropped 1,000 revolutions. So that means the ball, backspin helps the ball stay in the air. So it's come out, I've actually hit it better on that one, but I've lost 20 yards of carry. And then the ball's landing hot, running out. Now you could argue total distance is good, but along the ground yardage, especially if you're trying to play into a par 3 green, is pretty useless. So I've got a lot less control because the ball doesn't peak as high. Ball speed helps the height. So if you don't have a strong ball speed, a low lofted iron comes out very, very low. Now, I'll switch over to a hybrid at the same loft. Now, if I can swing this at basically the same speed, one, you've got a club head that's a lot bigger, much more perimeter weighting, much more forgiveness. If I can swing this at the same kind of speed, well, one, you can see from where it hit it's a couple of miles an hour higher. Didn't strike it actually as well as the 4-iron, but it's gone to 17 degrees of launch. It's a similar spin because of the strike, but it's got high up in the air. So for a worse hit, I've got more yardage. So and as we've switched the screen there, 20 feet more height. That's a real help, because even with a slight miss, it's staying in the air. If I mishit the 4-iron with a low flight, it falls out the sky. So that's a really key reason to be looking at where do you stop the irons. If you move too high at the irons, i.e. to a too low lofted head, you lose carry distance progression and you lose forgiveness. So that's a really critical thing to be looking at in the transition from your kind of irons into your hybrids, and why certain club heads are going to work better for you.
Okay, so now on to the wedges, a technical part of the bag, I feel, but you can get this horribly wrong if you don't get the right bounce and grind configuration in hand. We've got two prime examples here, the Cleveland CBX here, bigger sole design, as you can see, very forgiving, but a little bit one-dimensional to a certain extent, but greatly suited to a particular type of golfer. And then on the flip side here, you've got your T grind, used by the tour pros to magnificent sort of ability levels, but not necessarily the right wedge for everybody.
Yeah, and there are so many options, there are so many brands, there's so many grinds. Where do you start? I think the key thing for me at this stage of the game is do not overcomplicate this part of the bag. Yes, the top players, some of the low handicappers will play outside of a pitch wedge, 1, 2, 3 out of set wedges, 3 specialist wedges. But that actually requires a lot of skill and a lot of practice to know what your yardages are, what they're used for, different scenarios, lies, sand, all of that stuff. I would certainly be advising at this stage in the game, keep it simple and get proficient at using a couple of wedges. And it might be you go to pitch wedge and just have a sand wedge, a 56 degree wedge, because it's far more important to develop your technique at this point and not muddy the waters with, is it the sand wedge, is it the lob wedge, is it the gap wedge? You can add those clubs in as they become important, as they're going to make a difference. But mastering this bit of the bag, getting proficient with a club that you can develop it might sound a bit corny, but develop a bit of a relationship with and start to trust, I would value more than having lots of options that are just going to confuse the heck out of you.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, and actually sometimes having too much loft in hand can actually be a hindrance as opposed to a positive thing. Again, we're always driven by what the guys on TV do, the pros, but they're very proficient at what they're doing as well, and they're very good with every club along in the bag. They're very well practiced, but actually too much loft can actually, in my opinion, can actually cause it to be unusable to a certain extent, in terms of you can't get any real distance out of it, and you have to use an incredible amount of speed to chip with it around the green. So yeah, sometimes dialing loft back can actually be advantageous, I think. So don't be afraid to drop the high lofted wedges out of the bag at this point as well.
Yeah, less is quite possibly and quite probably less is more at this stage. But why would we be looking at that sort of sole shape versus the narrower type?
Sure. Well, again, both of these are really going to work with totally different delivery positions. So the thing is with a narrower sole like this, for the professionals, is they're going to use the sole and different parts of the sole at different points in time on their technique and depending on the type of shot that they're trying to hit. This sole here is really designed to be played one particular way. It's got a lot of forgiveness to it because of the width and the size of the sole. And so therefore I think if you're at a beginner level building your bag, then this is probably going to be better for you. It's going to allow you to play with a little bit more consistency. There's that word again that we've spoken about. If you're a little bit more proficient and maybe you're coming back into the game after a break and you're building a new bag, then maybe you might have been a good chipper in the past. You might want to get into something with a little bit more what we call bounce and grind, at which point, definitely go and get fitted for it again. But I would say, you know, bounce and width is going to be your friend to start with in the game.
Yeah, whilst a lot of the sets do a sand wedge within the set, they tend to be not really designed specifically in the same way as these wedges are for purpose. They're an extension of the set as someone just to kind of fill out the bag. Now they've got a lot better over the last few years, but as Nick described, the sole shape and the way that this head's put together, that blunting on the leading edge, that grind, that relief on the back edge is all designed to help the clubhead work through the turf, and you're just not going to see that level of versatility out of the set heads. So certainly something to look outside of just extending, you know, whatever brand and model it is into the sand wedge. I would look at, so Cleveland do a forgiving wedge head. Cobra do a forgiving wedge head, in particular the sort of slightly oversized, slightly bigger sole shape, which visually is going to track more and look more consistent off the back of a more forgiving iron head as well. So it's not like going to basically this is just a blade. This is in line with that really unforgiving iron head we were talking about earlier. You know, there's no perimeter weighting, there's no forgiveness. So having a wedge head that tracks off the iron heads with that same perimeter weighting, certainly something to strongly consider, but again, try one. Make sure it's comfortable, make sure it looks nice behind the ball. Confidence is so key in that respect. Confidence in this bit of the bag.
Absolutely.
Gold.
It's a question we ask during our fittings is how do you like the look of that wedge down behind the ball, and the reason for that is because actually when you get out onto the golf course, it is key, it is essential. You have to enjoy that front edge, how it sits behind the ball. It has to give you the confidence that you're going to be able to execute the shot you want to execute. So it's a question that we ask. You can't really put a value on it, but ultimately you need to ask yourself when you're looking down on that wedge, whether it fills you with confidence mainly.
And pertinent to that, I'm going to put this one away.
Yeah.
Around the green, chipping.
Yeah.
Now, these clubs, the chippers, in this case it's the Ping Chip R, do attract some criticism from your golfing buddies. However, these clubs can be invaluable to getting the golf ball up and down regularly, getting, again, consistency of successful shots around the greens where the touch, the technique is at its real kind of highest to executing a good shot. So why is that? Well, you've got a head that's much more like one of the iron heads. You've got a sole shape that's nice and versatile. But in terms of the way the club plays, it's got a lot less loft on than a sand wedge. So these are generally 8 iron loft. So around 38 degrees of loft rather than 56. And as Nick alluded to earlier, high loft means you have to move it fast, create speed to get the ball to go a distance. And around the greens, through the air, this might sound counterintuitive based on what we said for the long game, through the air is a bit volatile, is hard, because you've got to carry it a specific distance, and if you miss-hit it, it goes nowhere.
It takes more judgment.
Yeah, it takes more judgment. Whereas this is going to come out lower and run out a little bit more.
It's going to be more predictable.
And Nick is going to very kindly display the difference in shot pattern
there we go.
With these two.
Okay. So in terms of the way I'm going to play this, it's going to be sort of back in my stance, hands forwards, and more of a chipping motion. Very simple pitch because I want this to come out and then roll out effectively. So into here, weight forwards, nice, just simple motion. And it does exactly what it says on the tin, which is absolutely fantastic. Now, if I look at the wider soled wedge, again, this is going to give me plenty of forgiveness, but I'm going to have to be a bit more precise with the way I'm trying to play this shot. Again, I'll use the same sort of technique, but it won't be as easy to execute as what the chipper was. Chipping is a strong part of my game, so I wouldn't necessarily vouch for the chipper in terms of personally for myself, but having said that, that felt much easier to execute than the sand wedge did for me.
Yeah, I think this goes along the lines of get the ball on the ground and running because it's more predictable than flying through the air and then having to land it soft. The pros make it look so easy, but they spend hours and hours and years practicing it to get proficient at carrying it specific distances with lots of spin. It's not that easy. So don't be shy about using one of these. If you test one out and try it out and it works and it gives you repeatability, don't discount it.
Put it in the bag.
So I hope that's been useful and giving you a really good idea on what to do to build a bag out from a starting point when you're getting back into the game or when you're just starting out. Loads to go through and loads to consider, but hopefully that clarifies a few things for you. We're going to be doing another video in a few weeks' time about building a bag on a budget, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss it.